I wanted to tell you a little bit about mesh types and mesh efficiencies. First of all, I want to define what efficiency means in terms of collecting water from fog. It's different from the amount of water you're collecting. The amount of water is certainly important. How many liters per day are you getting from each square meter of fog mesh that you have? But a different measurement is the efficiency. That basically says how much water that is in the fog are you actually getting? What percentage of it? So efficiency is given as a percentage. And if there's a ton of water in the fog, then 1 liter of water in a day may not actually represent very much. It might not represent a large percentage of the water that's actually you're capable of getting. So efficiency is kind of like of the water that's actually in the fog, how much of you actually getting of that? What percentage of it? You're never going to get 100%. But the question is what percentage, and is it possible to increase that percentage? And that's a very active area of fog research these days. So typical values that I've seen for the types of fog collectors that I've deployed, and I use several types of mesh, and I'll say a little bit about the mesh. This is the standard Rochelle mesh that is sold at Bayside Fog Collectors, and that I use as well in my research. And it looks like this, and is typically used in a double layer. So the double layer is more like this. And each of these layers has what's called a 35% shade coefficient, which means that about 35% of the area is covered by this mesh. Of course, that can vary depending on how stretched the mesh is or how loose the mesh is. So that percentage, even in of itself, is not perfect. And of course, if you double it, it depends how the two layers intersect, but it's somewhere between, say, 40 and 60% of coverage if you have a double layer of 35%, because they're not going to perfectly lay on top of each other, but some parts will. So there's going to be some variability in what percentage of the area that the wind can come is actually present. Note that you don't want 100%, because if this was fully covered, then the wind would tend to go around it and it wouldn't go through the mesh, and you wouldn't get very much collection from the fog. You also don't want to have a very low percentage, because then, although the wind would go through it, you wouldn't get a whole lot of collection surface. So it's a trade-off between allowing the air to pass and the amount of collection surface that's available. So this type of mesh can also be obtained in different colors. I happen to also have some white here, and it has to be oriented such that these, I call them the V's, are vertical, kind of like this. You can see the V's, the zigzags, but they're in a vertical orientation. That's what allows the mesh to perform best, this type of mesh. In the double layer, of course, is what's the amount of thickness that's optimal. I've even tried using single layer and triple layer, and the double layer does do better than either of those. Triple layer is just a little too much. Another type of mesh that I really like is a German mesh called Fog Ha-Tin mesh, and it looks like this. I think the structure's beautiful. It has a hexagonal geometry associated with it, and it's supposed to be aligned like this. It's not in a double layer, but in and of itself, it has some thickness to it. You can see there's maybe about a centimeter's worth of thickness associated with this mesh. So this one can also be deployed in a square meter, and an active area of research is comparing these types of mesh and which one's better. And in some of the fog regimes I've seen very similar collections from both types of mesh. I think when the fog is heavier, the German one tends to perform a bit better in my experience, and from what I've seen in other publications that have compared these mesh. So what's nice about the German, it has a lot of layers, but also a lot of area that the wind can pass through. So it's designed, I think, for fog collection, whereas the Rochelle mesh was not originally designed for fog collection. It's designed for more agricultural applications, but can also be used for fog collection. And since the Rochelle mesh is the standard, I typically use that for most of my research, but I also use the German mesh for comparative purposes and to make assessments as far as when one is better than another. So the German mesh might have efficiency slightly above 20%. I mentioned the Rochelle mesh. I've seen efficiencies between 20 and 30% typically. And the German and heavier fog regimes would probably be a little bit larger than that. In the fog regimes, the kind of fog we have in Monterey, I've seen very similar performances between the two. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of some of the different types of mesh that I've used. There's certainly other types that could be used. And there's a lot of research that's looking into how to improve this efficiency. And there's a lot more I can say about that research. I'll save that for future videos. But I'm hoping this gives you some idea about mesh and mesh efficiency.